Around my house I have mulch beds, and in these mulch beds I often find weeds growing in them. I need to spend a lot of time to keep pulling the weeds out to keep the area clean looking. Here's an example of what will happen if I don't keep up with my weed picking. This is July, so you can see the weed buildup after only 7 months of not keeping up with weed pulling. The whole area is overgrown. What I want to do now is pull out all these weeds and then see if there's a way that I can prevent them from coming back like this. But the first step is going to be a lot of weed picking. Here's the area after most of the weeds have been pulled. The plan is to move the mulch out of the way and then place a fabric weed barrier on top of the soil to block the weeds from growing through. But before I do that, I'm going to unload all the weeds that I picked. After most of the mulch has been raked up out of the way, I'll now come by with some weed killer to spray over the soil to hopefully kill any of the weed roots that survived me picking them. And then after spraying the weeds, I'll then spread some Preen weed preventer over the area. Once the area is sprayed and preened, we can lay down the weed barrier. I use these landscaping spike clips to keep the weed barrier in place. But I also found that cheap fence hooks seem to work as an alternative, especially if you have soft soil. And now I'm just going to lay down fabric over the entire area that I want to block weeds from. Once I have the weed barrier down, I can lay down some of the mulch I moved back on top of the weed barrier. And then fill in the empty spots with new mulch. And this is what the area looks like now with the weeds pulled, the weed barrier on top, and then the mulch on top of the weed barrier. Quite the improvement from where it stood before. A few months later, I decided to come back with some preen and add some preen to the mulch on top of the weed barrier as well. And this side of the house looked so well that I decided to try to do this to the other areas around my house that have mulch in front of them. Starting with first removing the mulch from the area so that it's clear to lay a weed barrier on top of it. And then laying over a weed barrier on top of the bare soil. And then laying down mulch on top of the weed barrier. and then continued this process to all the areas around my house.
Alright, so now the spring season, and you can see this dark area here, I put the weed barrier down. But up against the fence, I haven't. And this used to be all mulch, but we can see all the weeds that grew up right up against the fence compared to where I had the weed barrier.
Okay, this is the front yard, and we can see that there are more weeds here. And it's these ornamental grasses. These were inside the soil. They weren't growing in the wintertime when I laid the weed barrier down, but we can see they poked through the weed barrier. I'm hoping that this is going to be a one-time thing, since these grass roots existed before I put the weed barrier down, and it was just pushed through the weed barrier that was on top. Now, if we look at the side of the house where this whole journey started, we can see that it's a different story. On the side of the house here, not a lot of weeds have come through, and the ones that did are surface level. They didn't get underneath, for the most part, the weed barrier. So it's just going to be a light picking of weeds that I'm going to need to do and keep up with, but nowhere near as bad as what it was before. So I think it's fair to say that there's no foolproof way to get rid of weeds for good. But if you do the work and lay down a weed barrier, do preening, and do some maintenance of picking a small amount of weeds when they pop up, you can get a big improvement and make things a lot easier on yourself.